Have you ever wondered what respect really looks like when it is lived out inside a classroom? Not the kind of respect that is written in policies, or the kind that gets announced during graduation ceremonies, but the raw, human respect that flows naturally between teachers and students, no matter the subject or the grade level. What if I told you that a group of European academic leaders, deans who have spent their entire lives studying educational systems, flew thousands of miles and returned home saying that the one thing the world is missing, they found in the Philippines? It sounds surprising, maybe even unbelievable. Europe is known for its historic universities, prestigious traditions, and world-class professors. Why would these deans, men and women from countries with centuries-old institutions, suddenly describe classroom respect in the Philippines as Philippine Gold? That phrase alone, Philippine Gold, struck them so deeply that one of them reportedly whispered it while standing in a schoolyard in Manila, watching students bow their heads before a teacher. This is where our story begins. The man at the center of this story is named Professor Klaus Reinhardt. He is a tall, silver-haired German academic who has worked for more than 40 years in the university world. In Europe, he was used to classrooms where students debated fiercely with teachers, sometimes to the point of arrogance. He admired intellectual freedom, yes, but he often confessed privately that something was missing: a sense of humility, a deeper acknowledgement of the human relationship between mentor and learner. He did not expect to find it in the Philippines. In fact, when he was first invited to a conference in Manila, he almost declined. But the story took a turn the moment he set foot in a small public high school on the outskirts of Quezon City. Klaus had come only to observe, perhaps to give a short lecture on comparative education. Instead, what he saw left him silent. As he entered the classroom, the students stood up. Not just mechanically, not just because the bell rang, but with a kind of warmth that almost startled him. They greeted him in unison, their voices firm, yet filled with a softness, a melody almost. "Good morning, sir," they said, and then they bowed their heads slightly. It was not submission. It was respect. Genuine, unforced, deeply cultural. And here comes the first micro-shock. Klaus had traveled the world, Japan, the UK, even the Ivy League in America. Yet never had he seen students hold silence in a way that honored presence. For a moment, he felt embarrassed. He, the outsider, the guest, was being treated with more dignity than he believed he deserved. Later, as he sat in the back of the classroom, something even more surprising unfolded. The teacher, a middle-aged Filipina named Mrs. Santiago, walked among the students. They looked at her with eyes that were not filled with fear, but with reverence. When she asked a question, no one interrupted. Hands went up patiently, even when students were eager. And when one student gave a wrong answer, the class did not laugh. Instead, there was a gentle silence. Then another student raised a hand, offering help rather than mockery. Klaus wrote one word in his notebook: gold. It was this moment that he would later share with his fellow European deans when they all gathered that evening for a private dinner. Some of them had gone to rural schools in Cebu, others to universities in Davao, and the stories were the same. In classrooms across the Philippines, they had found something invisible yet powerful, something worth more than the latest technology, more than modern facilities. They had found a culture of respect so rare in today's world that they could only describe it in one phrase: Philippine Gold. Now let us pause for a moment. You might be thinking, respect in the classroom? Is that really so unique? Don't students everywhere show some form of respect? And yes, on the surface, they do. But what these European educators encountered was not just polite behavior. It was a living, breathing tradition deeply woven into the fabric of Filipino culture. It came from values of family, faith, and community. It was respect that went beyond the classroom and reflected a nation's soul. When Klaus shared his impressions with a local Filipino colleague, he admitted something that startled even himself. "In Germany," he said quietly, "students respect knowledge, but here they respect the person. That changes everything." That sentence marked the beginning of his transformation. For the first time in decades, he was not thinking about research metrics or global rankings. He was thinking about humanity. And it was happening not in a grand lecture hall in Europe, but in a modest classroom in the Philippines. This, dear listener, is the seed of the story we are about to follow. A story of how a handful of European deans, shaped by centuries of academic pride, discovered that the true treasure of education is not only in books or in brilliance, but in the silent, powerful respect that Filipino classrooms live out every single day. They came expecting to share knowledge. Instead, they left carrying a piece of Philippine gold. When Professor Klaus first accepted the invitation to the Philippines, he did so with modest expectations. In his mind, the Philippines was a developing nation with schools that might struggle with resources, textbooks that were perhaps outdated, and classrooms that lacked the cutting-edge technology he was used to in Germany. He thought his role would be simple: share his expertise, deliver a lecture, shake a few hands, and return home with a polite story to tell. But reality, as it often does, had other plans. On his second day, Klaus found himself visiting a small rural school outside of Manila. The building itself was unremarkable. Paint peeling from the walls, wooden desks scarred by years of use, electric fans buzzing softly in the corners. He noticed that the library was small, the computer room limited. By European standards, the facilities were humble, even lacking. And yet, as soon as the bell rang, something in the air shifted. The students poured in with energy, their uniforms crisp despite the heat of the day. They chatted softly, but as soon as Mrs. Santiago, the teacher, entered, the room fell into a respectful hush. Klaus could not help but compare this moment with his experience back home, where students often ignored the teacher's arrival, too busy scrolling on their phones or slouched in their chairs, waiting to be entertained. Here, it was different. Respect was not demanded. It was freely given. There was a boy in the front row, no older than 14, who caught Klaus's eye. His name was Miguel. The boy raised his hand with a kind of confidence Klaus rarely saw at that age. When called upon, Miguel stood up, straightened his posture, and spoke in clear English. His answer was thoughtful, but what struck Klaus was not the content. It was the way Miguel ended his response with a gentle, "Thank you, ma'am." Klaus scribbled furiously in his notebook. He had never seen a student thank a teacher simply for the chance to speak. Later that day, Klaus joined the students for lunch. He carried his tray awkwardly, expecting to eat quickly and move on. But then, something unexpected happened. A group of students, noticing him alone, invited him to their table. They cleared space, offered him water, and asked about his life back in Germany. There was no fear, no awkwardness, only genuine curiosity wrapped in politeness. One girl even asked if professors in Europe were respected the same way as teachers in the Philippines. Klaus hesitated before answering. For the first time, he realized he did not know what to say. And then came another moment, quiet but unforgettable. As the lunch period ended, one student, perhaps 12 years old, picked up Klaus's empty cup without a word and carried it to the sink. Klaus was stunned. In Europe, he thought, such an act would be considered servile, even unnecessary. But here, it was not about hierarchy. It was about care, about honoring the presence of another human being. That night, Klaus sat alone in his hotel room, replaying the day in his mind. He remembered the faces, the voices, the way respect had flowed so naturally from student to teacher, from child to adult, even from host to guest. He asked himself a question he had not asked in years. Had he underestimated what true education meant? This was not about test scores, rankings, or research output. This was about shaping character, about teaching young people how to live with dignity, humility, and compassion. He began to wonder whether the so-called advanced systems of Europe had lost something essential in their pursuit of intellectual superiority. The next morning, Klaus met with his fellow deans, who had also spent time in different schools across the country. Their stories mirrored his own. One dean from France shared how students in Cebu had insisted on carrying her bag from the car to the classroom, treating her not as a stranger, but as a respected elder. Another dean from Italy confessed that he had been moved to tears when students in Davao knelt in prayer before class, not as a ritual, but as a heartfelt expression of gratitude for the gift of learning. These were not isolated incidents. They were threads woven into a larger cultural fabric, threads that told of a nation where respect was not taught in seminars, but passed down through generations, rooted in family, faith, and community. By the end of the week, Klaus felt the first stirrings of transformation. He no longer saw the Philippines as a place with less. Instead, he began to see it as a country with more humanity, more warmth, more of that elusive quality the world seemed to be losing. And though he did not yet have the words, deep inside he knew that what he had witnessed was something precious, something golden. The phrase would come later, spoken over dinner, but the seed was planted in those classrooms, in those quiet acts of respect, in those moments that left him silent and humbled. On their final evening in Manila, the European delegation gathered in a quiet dining hall overlooking the bay. The sunset painted the sky with shades of gold and crimson, and perhaps it was no coincidence, for that evening would give birth to the phrase that would define their journey. Klaus sat at one end of the table, still carrying his notebook filled with scribbled observations. Around him, the other deans spoke in low, thoughtful voices. Gone was the usual academic arrogance, the pride of men and women used to commanding lecture halls and drafting policy papers. Instead, they carried the weight of what they had seen in classrooms across the Philippines. The French dean, Madame Duval, was the first to break the silence. She leaned forward, her eyes moist. "I visited a small Catholic school in Cebu," she began. "The children stood before the lesson and whispered a prayer. Not out of fear, not out of routine, but with a sincerity that I have not seen in decades." She paused, her voice trembling. It made me wonder, when did our children stop thanking God for knowledge? There was a hush at the table. Klaus felt a shiver down his spine. It was not the kind of statement one expected from a French academic, trained in secular traditions, but it carried truth that everyone recognized. Then came Professor Bianchi from Italy. He had spent his visit in Davao and still seemed overwhelmed. "I gave a lecture on history," he said, "and when I finished, the students applauded. Not politely. They applauded with joy, as if I had given them a gift. Do you know what struck me? Back home, lectures are endured. Here, they are embraced. The respect in their eyes. This is not ordinary. It is something sacred." Klaus listened, his heart beating faster. These were not sentimental travelers exaggerating their experiences. These were scholars, intellectuals who rarely allowed themselves to be moved by emotion. Yet here they were, describing moments of reverence and gratitude that words barely captured. And then, perhaps the most powerful moment of the evening came when Dean Schneider, a stoic man from Switzerland, spoke softly. "I entered a classroom in Bulacan," he recalled, "and before the teacher began, a student stood up and said, 'Thank you, ma'am, for teaching us today.' That was all, a single sentence, but I had to turn away, because I felt ashamed. Ashamed that in my own country, teachers are often mocked, taken for granted, treated as mere employees. Here, they are honored." His voice broke slightly as he added, "That respect, that is your gold." The table fell into silence again. Outside, the waves of Manila Bay lapped gently against the shore, as if echoing the weight of his words. Klaus felt the phrase settle in his chest like a revelation. Philippine Gold. It was not wealth mined from the earth. It was not a resource to be traded. It was the invisible treasure of a culture that still knew how to honor its teachers, its elders, its mentors. That night, the group agreed on something extraordinary. They decided to draft a joint statement, not for politics, not for publicity, but for themselves. A statement that would capture what they had seen and remind them never to forget. Klaus wrote the first line. "The true wealth of the Philippines lies not only in its land or resources, but in the respect that its children carry into their classrooms. This is Philippine gold." For Klaus, it was a turning point. All his life, he had believed in rankings, in metrics, in the measurable achievements of institutions. But here, in a country often dismissed as small or developing, he had found something immeasurable yet infinitely valuable. And as he looked around the table at his fellow deans, he saw the same realization reflected in their eyes. They had come to the Philippines as experts, perhaps even as judges. They were leaving as students, students of a culture that had quietly preserved a treasure the rest of the world had forgotten. That evening, Klaus closed his notebook and did something he had not done in years. He prayed. He prayed not for success or recognition, but for the humility to carry what he had learned back to Europe. He prayed that he would never again look at a classroom the same way. And in that prayer, he whispered the words he would later repeat to countless colleagues back home. "Respect is our missing treasure, and the Philippines has kept it alive." When Klaus returned to Germany, he carried more than a suitcase. In his heart, he carried a burden, one that glowed like a secret flame. For days, he replayed the sights and sounds of the Philippines, the voices of children rising in respectful unison, the bowed heads before teachers, the whispered prayers of gratitude. Each memory felt alive, as if Manila itself had followed him home. But reality in Europe was quick to remind him of its colder nature. His first lecture back at the university was on a gray Monday morning. Students shuffled into the hall, earbuds in, eyes fixed on their phones. Some arrived late, unapologetically, sliding into their seats with no greeting. Klaus cleared his throat as he began, but half the class did not look up. They were present, yes, but their attention belonged elsewhere. For the first time in his career, Klaus felt an ache in his chest. He thought of Miguel, the boy who had stood with gratitude in his eyes, and he wondered, how could two classrooms exist on the same planet and feel so utterly different? Later that week, Klaus met with his colleagues at the faculty board. Over coffee and papers, he shared his experiences in the Philippines. At first, they listened politely, nodding as he described the discipline, the warmth, the reverence. But when he used the phrase, Philippine Gold, the room fell awkwardly silent. One professor chuckled under his breath. Respect? Klaus, that is not gold. Gold is innovation. Gold is research output. Gold is Nobel Prizes. Another, more diplomatic, said, We cannot idealize what you saw. Respect is nice, yes, but our system values critical thinking, independence, freedom of expression. Deference to teachers can sometimes stifle that. Klaus tried to explain. He told them that what he had seen was not blind obedience. It was dignity. It was the acknowledgement that knowledge is not just information, but a gift, and the giver must be honored. But his words seemed to float above their heads, dismissed as the sentimental ramblings of a man softened by travel. And yet, something inside him had shifted too deeply to ignore. Klaus began to weave his Philippine experience into his lectures. When students interrupted or showed indifference, he paused, not in anger, but in reflection. He would tell them about classrooms in Manila where students stood to greet a teacher, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. At first, his German students laughed. Some rolled their eyes. But a few, just a few, fell silent, curious. One afternoon, after such a story, a young woman approached him privately. "Professor," she said softly, "I don't think we've ever been taught to respect our teachers that way. Maybe we're missing something." Her words gave Klaus hope. Perhaps change would not come quickly, but it could begin one heart at a time. Meanwhile, the other deans were facing similar struggles across Europe. Madame Duval returned to Paris and spoke at a national education forum. She shared the story of Filipino children bowing their heads in prayer. The audience clapped politely, but afterwards one official told her, "That is charming, but impractical for France. We are a secular nation. We cannot mix reverence with education." In Italy, Professor Bianchi gave an interview where he spoke about the joy and respect he witnessed in Davao. The journalist smiled and called it a beautiful travel anecdote. The phrase stung. It reduced his life-changing experience to nothing more than a tourist's diary. And yet, even amid the skepticism, the seed of Philippine Gold began to take root. A handful of European educators, touched by the sincerity of their colleagues, began asking questions. What would it mean to restore respect to the heart of education? Could academic freedom and humility coexist? Could classrooms in the West rediscover the sacredness of learning? For Klaus, the answers were not easy. He faced criticism, sometimes even ridicule. But each time he doubted, he remembered the child who carried his empty cup, the student who whispered, "Thank you, ma'am," the dean who wept at a simple prayer. Those images became his shield. And slowly, he began to see a pattern. Respect could not be imported like a textbook or a program. It had to be lived, breathed, modeled. He began with small changes. He greeted his students at the door. He thanked them for their questions. He listened with patience, even when answers were clumsy. He treated his classroom not as a stage, but as a space of shared dignity. To his surprise, something shifted. The atmosphere grew warmer, less transactional. Some students noticed. A few even began returning the gestures, offering quiet words of thanks at the end of lectures. It was not the Philippines, no, but it was a beginning. And so Klaus realized something profound. Philippine Gold was not a treasure to be locked away within the archipelago. It was a gift to be shared, a light that could travel across oceans if only hearts were open enough to receive it. Months after the journey, Klaus stood before an international education summit in Geneva. Delegates from every corner of the globe were present. Professors, policymakers, ministers of education. The room was filled with the sharp hum of intellectual ambition, with discussions of AI-driven classrooms, data analytics, and global rankings. It was a world Klaus knew well. Yet as he approached the podium, he carried with him a story that was not about technology or statistics. It was about something the data could never measure. He began simply, "In Europe, we often pride ourselves on innovation, on academic freedom, on the pursuit of excellence. But in my recent travels, I discovered that we may have lost something that another nation has kept alive." The room quieted. Screens flashed behind him, ready to display graphs and numbers, but Klaus ignored them. Instead, he spoke of the Philippines. He told the story of Miguel, the boy who thanked his teacher simply for the chance to answer. He spoke of the girl in Cebu, who prayed sincerely before class. He described the moment in Bulacan when a student honored his teacher with nothing more than a few quiet words that left a Swiss dean in tears. And then he spoke the phrase aloud for the first time on a global stage. Respect in the classroom is not a minor detail, it is Philippine gold. Some in the audience shifted in their seats, uncertain, but Klaus pressed on. His voice grew stronger, steadier, filled with conviction. Gold is rare. It is precious. It is something we seek but seldom find. And yet, in the classrooms of the Philippines, it shines every day. It shines not in the wealth of buildings or the abundance of resources, but in the dignity of children who honor their teachers, and in the humility of teachers who honor their students. This, my friends, is the wealth that cannot be bought. This is the treasure the world must learn to see. There was silence. Not the impatient silence of a restless crowd, but the deep silence of people struck by something undeniable. And then, unexpectedly, applause began, not thunderous but steady, respectful, rising like a tide. Delegates from Asia stood first, followed by a few from Africa, then others, until even those skeptical at the start found themselves clapping. Klaus did not smile. Instead, he bowed his head slightly, as if the applause was not for him, but for the nation that had given him this gift. Later that evening, a delegate from South America approached him. "Professor," she said softly, "I think you are right. We have forgotten how to respect our teachers. Maybe the Philippines has something to teach us all." It was in that moment Klaus realized the truth. The Philippines was not just preserving respect for itself, it was preserving it for the world. Like a guardian of a flame, it had kept alive what others had let die out. And so he concluded with words that would echo long after the conference ended. If we wish to rebuild dignity in education, we must look to the Philippines. For in their classrooms, I saw a future that is brighter than any technology, richer than any resource. Philippine gold is not theirs alone. It is a gift to humanity. From that day forward, the phrase began to spread. Articles quoted it. Educators whispered it. Some dismissed it. Others embraced it. But none could ignore it. And slowly, a quiet movement began. A movement inspired not by power or wealth, but by the humble respect of Filipino classrooms. For Klaus, the journey had come full circle. He had arrived in Manila expecting to teach. Instead, he had been taught. He had come as a dean, a man of titles and accolades, and left as a student of respect. And as he walked out of the Geneva summit into the cool night air, he whispered the words once more, this time not as an observer, but as a believer. Philippine gold. The world must know. If you believe that Philippine Gold, this spirit of respect, is something the whole world must learn from, share this video with your friends and family. Let's remind the world of the treasure our nation carries.